Hey guys, so here's part 2 of the 5.2 day 1 notes. Now we're going to talk about in behavior. Basically, what is in behavior? It's the behavior of the graph as x approaches infinity. Basically, what we're going to do is look at the arrows or the ends of our graph, okay? So you'll notice when we have an even degree, either, the graph opens up or it opens down. Like when we talked about quadratics. If it opens up, that means the arrows both face up. If it opens down, the arrows will face downward, okay? And so that means that's when we have a negative leading coefficient. Now with odd degrees, basically the arrows are going to go opposite direction, either from negative to positive or from positive to negative. Now let's talk about how do we know. Let's look at this. So this is our summary. This is what you need to know for quizzes and tests and when you do your homework assignment. Even degrees and the leading coefficient is positive. So remember, even degrees, that's going to be like our quadratic. So this is when we have a degree of 2, 4, 6, and our a value is positive. Okay, so think about a quadratic, right? With a quadratic, that's an even, and let's say our a is positive. Our graph opens up, okay? So what's happening with our arrows? Well, as x, so you'll kind of read this as x, and then you see this arrow. This means approaches, okay? So as x approaches negative infinity. So what does that mean, approaches negative infinity? That means the x values are getting smaller. So as x approaches negative infinity, what's happening to our y values? Well, the y values are increasing, or another way of saying f of x, which also means y, is approaching positive infinity. Okay, so that means that's an up arrow. Okay, what happens when x approaches positive infinity? That means x is going to the positive direction. Well, what's happening with our y's? Well, the y's are also increasing or going towards positive infinity. So f of x is going towards positive infinity. Okay, so anytime you have an even degree and the leading coefficient is positive, what we will say is that we have two up arrows, or infinity, infinity. Okay. Okay, now let's say we still have an even degree, but the coefficient, the leading coefficient is negative. So a is negative. This is when our graph opens down, right? That means we're going to go to negative infinity. So as x approaches negative infinity, so as our x values go to negative or get smaller, so does our y values. They go to negative infinity. As x approaches positive infinity, that means our x values are increasing, our y values are decreasing. So they're going to negative infinity. As you can see, f of x goes to negative infinity. So we have two down arrows, and they both represent. So notice with the evens that the arrows go the same way. So even degrees, arrows face the same direction. But now let's talk about odd degrees, okay? So odd degrees represent like when we have 1, 3, like 1, 3, 5. And what if our leading coefficient is positive? So a is positive. This is like, let's talk about linear functions, okay? So as our x approaches negative infinity, meaning that our x is going to negative, so does our y values, the arrows facing down. So that means f of x goes to negative infinity. So we have a down arrow. Well, what happens when our x approaches positive infinity? So as our x increases or goes more positive, notice that our y value, or the f of x, that also increases. So that means f of x approaches positive infinity. Okay? So we have negative infinity and then positive infinity. Okay, now let's talk about odd degrees, but when our leading coefficient is negative. So a is negative. Now that means our line switches. So what happens when as x approaches negative infinity? Well, as x approaches negative infinity, notice that f of x, or the y values, is increasing. So that means f of x is approaching positive infinity. So we have the up arrow. Now what happens as x approaches positive infinity? So as our x increases, what's happening with our y's? The y's are decreasing. It's going to negative infinity. So that means our f of x approaches negative infinity. Okay. So we have an up-down. So notice with odd degrees, the arrows go different directions. So arrows face different directions. Okay. Okay, so in our next video, which will be our last for 5.2 day 1, we're going to include this in behavior and try to do different problems.